know how amazing it is to have James Burrows with us today? I think you must. That's why you're all here. He's an iconic director. He directed Cheers, Frasier, Friends, Taxi, Will and Grace. He's amazing. I know you shared many a laugh watching his shows. The list of awards is never ending. And he's had an incredible career you're going to hear about. And who better to speak with than our own, the Desert's own, David Lee, who just happened to create Frasier and Wings. He was the writer and co-producer for Cheers and The Jeffersons, among other things. I'm going to let them tell you more about themselves. Please join me in welcoming James Burrows and David Lee.
Thank you. Always looking for business. It's such a thrill for me to be here today with my mentor and my friend of 40 years, we decided, since the first day I walked into the Cheers offices. I'm going to read a little bit about who this is and what he's done. James Burrows has directed over 1,000 episodes of sitcom television and has earned 11 Emmy Awards and 5 Directors Guild Awards. His 5-decade career in the theater began in the theater, stage managing on Broadway and directing regional theater. In 1974, he began his TV career directing episodes of Mary Tyler Moore, The Bob Newhart Show, and Laverne and Shirley. He became a resident director on Taxi and then co-created the beloved classic Cheers, directing 243 of the 273 episodes, as well as all of the 246 episodes of Will and Grace. He has directed pilots and multiple episodes of Frasier, Friends, Mike and Molly, the pilots of 2.5 Men, and The Big Bang Theory, and hundreds of other shows where he has nurtured and mentored some of television's biggest stars. Mr. Burrows.
Mr. Lee.
A recent review of your book said, over a career directing more than 1,000 episodes of TV, the gracious Mr. Burrows has emphasized kindness and collaboration, seeing his role as protecting writers' visions, thank you, and eliciting the best possible performances from the actors. He's a lucky, hard-working guy with some great stories to tell. I totally concur. Let's tell some. First, I want to ask a simple question. What the hell do you do? I mean, 4-camera sitcom director, what is that?
I enable.
Perfect. But I mean, tell us about what 4-camera is, and is it the same as directing a 1-camera show, or like a movie or a play?
4 cameras are a 4-camera show, a multi-camera show, is a show that's filmed in front of a live audience. So I grew up in the theater. I'm a theater rat. So what I do is I do for 3 days a week, I do a play. I work with writers to construct a good play of 20, 25 minutes. And then I use 4 cameras to film the play. So the camera is not a character, it's just capturing the action. So that, in essence, is what I do. I film theater.
Good explanation. Is it funnier than a single camera?
It is, because you have to make 300 people in the audience laugh, as opposed to a single camera show where you have to make 2 writers laugh.
Okay, now that we got it settled of what exactly it is you do, you were born in Los Angeles, and at the age of 5, moved back to New York?
That is correct.
Something like that? Your father was the amazing Abe Burrows. I remember him from What's My Line? Mm-hmm. He was a bon vivant, a playwright, a talk show guest, but more importantly, the author of Guys and Dolls, Can, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, and many more. Tell us what it was like growing up in that heady atmosphere. Like, did Cole Porter and Kitty Carlisle come to dinner?
Yes. Yes, my father was, he was what they called the intelligentsia in New York. He had New Year's Eve parties that my sister and I went to. And Cole Porter would show up, Capote would show up, Comden and Green, Cy Fewer, Ernie Martin. And, I talk about in the book one New Year's Eve party, I was sitting at the buffet, sitting at one of the tables after I got my food. And I was sitting there, and all of a sudden I look, and John Steinbeck has sat next to me. And I'm, I'm 17, 18 years old, so I hadn't really read any of his books. Except I think, I think we read East of Eden, or, I think we read that one. So anyway, he sits down next to me, and he's in his cups. And he says to me, "Who are you?" And I say, "I'm Abe's kid," which I was when I was growing up. And he said, "You want to see my Nobel Prize speech?"
That sounds like a come on.
Yeah, I know, yeah. So he reached into his pocket and pulled out a tattered couple of pieces of paper and read me his Nobel Prize speech. And I didn't only in hindsight do I realize how a wonderful moment that was. And so those were my dad's parties. So I did, run with that crowd.
I'm so envious.
I know.
So envious. You went to Yale. You studied theater, right?
I went to Oberlin College, undergraduate,
right,
where I didn't do theater at all. And then when I graduated, the Vietnam War was happening, and so I decided to defer. So I went to the Yale School of Drama.
Uh-huh. And after that, you paid your dues in regional theater and and straw hat theater companies as a stage manager and director, and basically do anything.
Yeah,
they
I was.
ask you
Yeah,
to.
I did. I had a few stage managing jobs, but then once I started to stage manage on Broadway, I would go to dinner theaters and straw hat theaters and do other productions of that show that I stage managed.
Right. And finally, you land a job as the stage manager for a brand new Broadway musical, which is one of the most notorious flops in the history of the Great White Way. Tell us about that and how it was the key to your opening the door to the television industry.
In 1965, I was hired to be the assistant to the assistant to the assistant stage manager. So it was my first job on the Broadway stage. And it was a production of a musical of Breakfast at Tiffany's. And it was written by my dad, and it was not his best work. However, the cast was two newcomers to the Broadway stage, Dr. Kildare and Laura Petrie, Mary Tyler Moore and Richard Chamberlain. So I was literally in charge of these neophytes from California who were coming east to be in the theater, and I would be there, I would run lines with them, I would get their lunches, I would make sure when the show was up and running that they knew where to enter the stage, and when they came off, got them back to their dressing room. So that, in essence, was my job. And we went out of town with this play, with this musical, and we had a huge advance because of Laura Petrie and Dr. Kildare. And then David Merrick, who was a notorious producer on Broadway and a brilliant one, but he was the Scott Rudin of his day, and he decided that he didn't like the production. So he fired my father. He fired the director. He fired my father as writer and director, hired a new director, and then hired somebody to do the musical comedy book, who was known for his musical comedy books, Edward Albee. So the first thing Edward did was to put in Holly's abortion in the musical. So my job changed a little bit. Well, at that point, when my dad was replaced, I said to him, "Can I stay on the Titanic?" And he said, yes, you can. So I was then designated. I would go down to Edward's loft down on 10th Street, and I would get the pages, because there was no faxing and no email back then. So I would get his new pages and bring them up. Anyway, so rather than go back out of town, we opened in town in New York for previewing before we were going to open officially. And the show opened on a Monday night, and it was hooted off the stage. It was a horrible experience. And I would wait in the wings for Mary to come off, and Mary Tyler Moore would come off and throw her arms around me, crying, weeping. And this went on for 4 nights, 4 performances, until Merrick decided to close the play. So the last night when we went, we had a wake at Sardi's. Wow, people know what Sardi's is. Wow, I know you know what a wake is, but Sardi's. I waited at Sardi's until Grant Tinker, who was her husband, they were married then, flew in from California, and I went home. So I had formed this kind of bond with Mary Tyler Moore. So that led to, so I put that in the back of my head, and then went out and directed dinner theater and More Straw Hat, and I did Milt Kamen and Arnold Stang in The Odd Couple, and I did Joanne Worley in Goodbye Charlie, and I ran a theater in San Diego for a while, and then I was doing a play. I was doing Joan Fontaine in 40 Carats, and on a Saturday night after rehearsal, I went home and I turned on the TV, and there was the Mary Tyler Moore show on. I had never seen it before, and I noticed that they were doing a show in front of a live audience, because back in the 60s when I was watching TV, I had no idea Dick Van Dyke's show was in front of a live audience. That didn't enter my ken at all. So I saw the show, and I said, they're doing 25 minutes in a week, and I'm doing a 2-hour play in a week. So I think maybe I can do that. So I literally wrote Mary Tyler Moore a letter that's in the book, and I got an answer from Grant Tinker about a month later, and he said, "We'd like to bring you out to California because we have now 4 multi-camera sitcom shows that we're producing, and we want theatrical directors, because you can always learn how to do the cameras. As David knows, he was a writer who learned how to do the cameras, but you can't learn how to deal with actors. You have to know that," which David knew. And so I said, yeah, sure, why not? So I went out in May of '74, and in 2 years it'll be 50 years that happened. Wow. So
tell us a little bit about the culture at MTM, the way they treated writers and directors and that sort of thing.
Yeah, MTM was the place to be. You have all the Jim Brooks and Alan Burns and Ed Weinberg and Stan Daniels and Patchett and Tarsus, and eventually Bochco went there. And so we went there. I didn't have a choice. That's the only person I knew. But writers wanted to go there because Grant Tinker, who oversaw the company for Mary, created this wonderful workspace. It was like the early days of Apple, that kind of thing. We all were part of the company. We all were trying to make great shows. And what Grant did is he dealt with the networks. The networks would have notes about your show and everything like that, and Grant would say, "Tell me the notes." And they would tell him to Grant, and he would never communicate them to the writers. And so everybody felt protected. Everybody fought for what they wanted. And Grant was the adjudicator at that point. If Grant didn't like it, he would tell you. But Grant was a guy who hired writers and let them do what they wanted to do. In fact, that's Grant calling right now from up there, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well. So you start directing there. One of the things that struck home to me was you mentioned in the book the family trees of sitcoms, that there are different lineages. One of them is the Mary Tyler Moore lineage, where one show begets another show, which begets another show, and another is the Gary Marshall lineage. And I think, now that I think about it, Norman Lear is probably another one of those lineages. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, back in those days, there were only 3 networks. So I like to say the difference between television in those days and television now is in those days there were 3 networks and 30 great comedy writers. Now there are 500 networks and 30 great comedy writers. So the lineage is when there was a hit show like The Mary Show, people learned on that show. You got shows under your belt before you decided to do your own show. So you learned the inner workings of television. You learned about casting. You just because you wrote one episode of a show, you didn't get hired. You had to put in your work. So Mary spawned Rhoda, and spawned Phyllis, and spawned 1 Hour Luke Grant. And then Gary spawned from Happy Days, it's Laverne and Shirley, and Angie, and Mork and Mindy. And these were pedigree shows. They came out of Gary, but Gary had writers who he trained to do it. And Norman was the same way. Norman had a group of writers, and Norman was a great leader. And so, these were well-trained writers. And so that's what you need to have a successful show. You need somebody who knows the ropes, somebody who knows how important it is to have vulnerabilities in characters. And because if they have vulnerabilities, they're going to be easier to identify for an audience, easy for the audience to hook into. So, lineage is important. It doesn't go on anymore now. It's just shows don't spawn other shows. It's a shame.
Yeah. Well, I like to consider myself lucky to be in the Mary Tyler Moore lineage,
yeah,
even though I never worked at Mary Tyler Moore.
Well, so. we blessed you, me and the Burrows.
You certainly did. At one point, you did Laverne and Shirley, and you were offered the opportunity to continue, but you declined. Was that part of what you call your fun clause?
Yes. Yeah. I after like 2.5 years, 3 years with Mary Tyler Moore, I was hired by Gary Marshall because Gary was very close with Jim Brooks. All those writers were close to do Laverne and Shirley. So I did this is the first year I did about 3 episodes. And it was fun. It was a lot of fun. I had, Penny was one of the great physical comics ever. And Michael and David always made me laugh. So I had fun. I was starting to get a little self-esteem then. What happened was that Cindy, the show was created by Gary Marshall. Tony Marshall, his dad, was the producer. Ronnie Hallen, Penny's sister, was the associate producer. And Penny was in the show. So it was Marshall heavy. And Cindy, she started by counting lines, which is a big mistake. So things started to blow up. Writing staff started to get fired, everything like this. And then Gary took me to lunch and said, would you like to run the show? Would you like to be the resident director? And I said, check, please. Because I because you could see the rumblings of problems, and I can't work in an atmosphere like that. I just, it was one of the first times I exercised my fun clause, which I like to say is in my contracts. It's not in my contracts. It's just understood that if I don't have a good time, I can leave. So that's why I passed. I didn't feel right doing that show.
Thanks. Your next stop on the Career Express was Taxi with the amazing James L. Brooks, who I actually met for the first time
really?
Friday night at your
Wow.
party. You say in the book, when I think about working on Taxi, the word that comes to mind is difficult. Why?
Because it was my first show that I agreed to be the resident director on. So I was really nervous to be working with Jim Brooks and Ed Weinberg and Stan Daniels and Dave Davis, who were the luminaries who had left Mary Tyler Moore to Paramount, gone to Paramount to create their own entities. And I was flattered that they asked me. I'm not sure why. I'm sure other people passed, So, but I was just, it was my first big gig, and I was nervous. And then I had to deal with an interplanetary cast. And I mean that in the sweetest sense. It was, predominantly they were from the theater. Judd, Danny, Mary Lou, Jeff Conaway had all been on Broadway. Tony Danza was a boxer. Andy Kaufman was a stand-up comic or a performance artist.
And really was interplanetary.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And eventually Chris Lloyd came on board, and there isn't a planet that he hasn't been on. And it was the first time that 4 cameras, I grew up in a 3-camera world. Mary Tyler Moore was 3 cameras. It was the first time that 4 film cameras were used permanently on a situation comedy. So I had all of this in front of me, and it was, it was difficult because I didn't have my cojones yet because I was still this fledgling kid, and I was tested on a number of fronts. Danny was tough. Judd was easy. Danny was tough. Andy was a doll, believe it or not. And, Ed and Jim were tough. Jim was also then writing a movie. A movie he had written was being directed, so he was there sometimes and on stage sometimes, and Ed was there sometimes and not there sometimes and on stage sometimes. So it was just really, really complicated. And, I got through it. I got through it by getting the cast to deal with one another and talk to me about what they didn't like, and being able to enable the cast to talk to the writers, which in sitcom, the writers over here, this gentleman, they run the show. They're the executive producers. They cast the show. They write the show. They talk about the scenic designs with the show. So it is a writers-driven medium. And what I had to do on that show is to knock down the walls between writers and actors, so actors could say what they wanted about the piece. And that's how I learned, because I watched the great Jay Sandrich, who was my mentor. And when he was dealing on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, when he was dealing with the writers, he would say what he felt. And, because he had talked to the actors, what they felt, and he would represent the actors. So that's what I had to do. And it was difficult. It was hard. It was my first really big job, and it worked out okay.
It worked out okay.
Yeah. There was the Andy Kaufman incident, but other than that, it was fine.
Yeah. Briefly tell us about Danny DeVito's audition.
Oh. Well, we were looking for Louis De Palma, and you have a lot of. I always thought he was going to be a big, heavy-set, heavy-set guy, really tough guy. So Danny walks in. Danny walks into the audition room, has the script in his hand, throws it down on the table there, and says, "Who wrote this shit?"
I love that story. Taxi had maybe the longest laugh in television history. Can you recount it for us?
I can. It was a show called Reverend Jim: A Space Odyssey. It was in the second year. It was Chris Lloyd's return to Taxi. He was in the first year because he marries Latka and Hooker, so Latka can stay in the country. So he was so good in that episode, we invited him back. And they sent me the script, and the script was written by Les and Glenn Charles. And I remember flying to New York, reading the script on the way, and laughing so hard at it that the stewardess said, "Are you okay?" And I said yes. And so in that show, the taxi drivers take Jim to his driving exam to be a taxi, his written exam. And it's a great scene, There are wonderful lines in it, like Jim looking at the application. It says eyes. He goes, eyes. And Mary Lou says, "Don't put two."
Hilarious.
And I don't remember. That's a tough choice. I don't remember what the straight line is. Anyway, so he fills out the form, and he goes and he sits for the written test. And the 4 cab drivers are watching him, and he goes, "Psst, what does a yellow light mean?" And Conaway says to him, "Slow down." And Reverend Jim goes, "What does a yellow light mean?" And when we shot the show, it went on for about a minute. Each time they would say, "Slow down," Chris Lloyd found a way to spin different ways. And I think it's maybe 15 to 30 seconds in the show, but it went on for a minute. And Jim Brooks is still to this day angry at me that I cut it off at a minute.
Well, after the 3rd season of Taxi, your mentor, Jay Sandrich, said, "You'll never know how good you are until you become your own boss." You and the Charles brothers, who were writing on the Taxi show, set out to do just that. How did you do that?
I guess we did it the right way. We both had the same agent, a man named Bob Broder, who is so important he was referred to only as Broder.
Or in my case, I called him Darth Broder.
Yes. Bob's a killer, and it's still my wonderful friend. Anyway, he said, you guys should do your own show. So a Jew from Southern California sat down with 2 ex-Mormons from Henderson, Nevada, to talk about doing a show. And we were all big fans of Fawlty Towers, and we thought about doing a show in a hotel. And then we said, well, probably the predominant place in the hotel would be the bar. Why don't we do a show about a bar? We talked about a bar in Barstow, because not for the alliteration, no. We thought about it because you get types going to Vegas and types coming back from Vegas who would stop there. And then we said, no, we're sports fans, so let's do a sports bar, and let's do it in a rabid city. So we decided on Boston. And We then talked about characters, and we always loved Tracy Hepburn relationship. You know, not Lee Tracy and Audrey Hepburn. So we talked about doing that, and we sat down in fourth year, I think, fourth year of Taxi, and started. I went and did a movie, and they stayed on Taxi for one more year, and then we really hashed it out, and we talked about these characters. And when Glenn and Les went off to write the show, we had the character of Sam Malone, or it's actually Sam Harrison, a wide receiver for the Patriots, and working for a woman. In other words, the original conception of the show was the conception we had when Kirstie Alley came in. So we went off with that. We had Coach, we had Carla. We knew we wanted Rhea. We had Norm, because everybody has a Norm in their bar. And the boys went off to write, and about a month later, I received a script at my doorstep, and I read it, and I immediately called them and said, "You have brought radio back to television." It was so literate. It was amazing. And they had created out of whole cloth this character of Diane Chambers. And without that character, and without Miss Long playing that character, Cheers doesn't make it to the second year. And so we had the script, we cast it, we had...
Talk a little bit about the casting. So I know you were down to 3 final couples.
Right.
And you went down to a bar set for Bosom Buddies or something?
Yeah. They had a bar set on Paramount. And we went down there and we rehearsed them. And we had 3 couples. We had three finalists. We had Fred Dreyer and Julia Duffy, Bill Devane and
Lisa
Eichhorn, and Ted and Shelley. And the closest one to Sam Harrison, the football player, was Ted Dreyer, because he was a defensive end for the Rams. And he was good. He didn't have much comic chops, but he had the persona of the character. But Ted and Shelley absolutely had the chemistry. And we brought the network down to see them. We brought the studio to see them, and it was a wonderful experience. And we went upstairs to talk about it with the executives. And one person wanted Fred Dreyer to play Sam Harrison, but it was obvious the choice was Ted and Shelley, because they had chemistry.
And Cheers was born.
Yeah.
My writing partner, Peter Casey, and I first worked on Cheers in season 3. And one of the first memories I had being in the writer's room up there was that you got bar mitzvahed. What was that about?
I was, my parents were atheists, and the worst kind of atheists, agnostics. And you never ask a 12-year-old Jewish boy if he wants to be a bar mitzvah. You can't ask him that question, because the answer will be no. You have to say you're being bar mitzvah. Well, they asked me the question. I said no. And so I didn't go to temple at all. And then my first wife was a conservative Jew. So I started to get on the shul bus at about my third year of marriage, and her parents lived in Tucson, and I would go to the temple there, and then so I started to feel a little bit more benevolent to the Jews, and when I would come up here, we joined a temple, and I would go on, I still do, I go on Yom Kippur and all the way through Nila, so I do that 24 hours. And also had a friend who was a member of an Orthodox shul, and we used to go there on Yom Kippur morning, and we would, try to sneak out before the appeal, but it never worked. And so one day when we were there, a member of the Orthodox shul said, "Have you been bar mitzvah?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Would you like to be?" And I said, Sure. It's another reason for my wife to buy a hat. So I don't read Hebrew. I learned the prayers in and out of the Haftorah, and I did all that, and I was bar mitzvahed, and it was a wonderful experience. My kids have been raised conservative, and they light the candles, and they break bread on Friday night on the shop.
What was the Charles Brothers comment on this?
Yes. They said that I was the only man they knew that was bar mitzvahed at 47 and lost his hair at 13.
That was also the year that a character named Fraser Crane entered the scene. And you say in the book, writing for Fraser Crane required an ear for pomposity. So the brothers brought in Peter Casey and David Lee. Quelle surprise. Talk about casting Kelsey Grammer in that part.
Well, the boys, again, they're geniuses, the Charles brothers. They're amazing human beings. They now have completely retired. One lives in Santa Barbara, the other lives in Pebble Beach, and they're happy. They have no kids, and I see them occasionally, and they were seminal in my life, and I love them both. And so we at the end of the second year of Cheers, we have Diane fall for an artist, a crazy artist, Semenenko. I don't remember his first name, but it was played by Christopher Lloyd, who was in Taxi. And they go off. So one of the things on Cheers we did was, at the end of every year, we had a cliffhanger. And we would paint ourselves into a corner and then figure out in the off season how to get out of it. So they came up with that she went to the loony bin. And at the loony bin, her doctor was Dr. Fraser Crane, who advised her to come back and confront your demons, being Sam Malone. So we had to cast this part. And I've told Kelsey this. His career he owes to John Lithgow, because we went to John Lithgow and he said no. So Kels admits that, So we started audition, and we couldn't find anybody in California. We started to see tapes from people in New York, and all of a sudden we saw a tape, and on the screen comes Kelsey and his face. And we all started laughing, and he read brilliantly, and we brought him out, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Let's see, I lost my place here. One of the first things that Peter and I found out when we found out we were going to be producing and writing Cheers was that Nicholas Colasanto had died. And we knew that the first order of business would have to be replacing him. And if you can talk a little bit about how we went about that.
It was Nicky Colasanto was sick when we started the show. We didn't know how sick he was, but he was so essential to the show, and it was just he was the father figure on the set. And when Nicky passed, the Cosby Show had come on our third year, so it was Cosby, Family Ties, Cheers, and designated show here. I'm not sure what that was originally. Madman of the People, maybe, or I don't remember. And so we had to replace Coach, and we were not going to go older. We didn't want to do old again. So we decided to go young because the breakout star of Family Ties was Michael J. Fox. So we figured if we could get, somebody young on the show. So we started casting, and the boys created the character of Woody. And we had a guy named John Pilgrim. We loved this guy. He was reed thin. He could have been a scarecrow. And because that was what the character was. And then I think the final 2 days of auditioning, Woody Harrelson walked in the room. And he walks in the room and he blows his nose. You blow it before you come in the room, right? He blows his nose, and Teddy's reading with these people. And Teddy reads with Woody, and Woody leaves the room, and Teddy said, "Oh my God." And everybody knew. David can tell you, you know when there's chemistry, you know when you got the guy.
And he was the only actor actually named Woody.
Yes.
Everybody thinks we did it the other way, but we didn't.
Yeah.
Not long after that, Shelley Long popped in and said, "Oh, I'm not going to be on the series anymore." Big headache.
Yes.
So, go ahead.
No, you going to embellish? No?
No, we're at Kirsty.
Yeah.
My note is, don't buy the first house you see.
Yeah. Shelley came in because she had done Irreconcilable Differences, a movie, and Outrageous Fortune, another movie with Bette Midler, and they were hits. And Shelley said, I feel like I want to continue in the movies. And we had to, she had no contract after the first 5 years. So we said, go with God. And then when she left, we were scared out of our minds because Sam and Diane had driven that show. It was will they, won't they, breaking them up, getting them together. It was the piston in that show. So we didn't know what to do. We talked about it for a while, and then we thought about the original conception of the show, which is Sam working for a woman. So I think the boys wrote a couple of sides for that. Sides are audition scenes. And we started to, we wrote those scenes. And when we told our casting director, Jeff Greenberg, what we were going to do, we told him by phone. He comes into the room and he says, "I have 2 words for you, Kirstie Alley." So we said, "Who?" He said, "Kirstie Alley." Now, I didn't say who because I had seen her do Cat on a Hot Tin Roof at the Mark Taper Forum. And she was extraordinary. Because she had only done one camera or movies or stuff like that. You had no idea of her comic chops. So she came in the room to read, and I think the 3 of us went, "Boo-ah," which is Sam Malone's line when he sees her, because she's striking. She's striking. Remember, she had a green outfit on, not Star Trek green, but green, and it was amazing. And she left, and then we saw some other people, and then.
Well, you wanted her right away, but it was the first house you
ever see, Yeah. So we auditioned other people, and nobody could beat her, so we hired her. And
but it wasn't a smooth.
No,
fit.
No, it's.
I remember in the writers' room, the first month or so of her being there, that we went, "Oh my God, what are we going to do? This isn't working." And what we did for a while was get her in the door and get her as quickly into the office as we possibly could. And then in a rehearsal, or I guess it was in rehearsal. It was.
In rehearsal, she was a martinet. She was tough with Sam. And it was just, it was just not working. So she had to exit into her office in a rehearsal period, and she goes to the office door, and she can't she can't turn the doorknob. And she starts crying.
Yeah.
She starts crying. And everybody starts laughing. And all of a sudden, it occurred to us that the character was this tough woman who was paper thin underneath. Not to demean women, just, was not what she was up there. And so once that happened, it opened up that character, and she exploded, and we ran 6 years with her and 5 years with Shelley. And then those final 6 years, you got to see how great the rest of the cast was. That extraordinary cast who each of them could carry their own show, own episode on Cheers. You never had to write away from anybody. You never had to, if the joke didn't work, it was not the actor's fault. Because they were,
Well, it certainly wasn't the writer's fault.
It was the director's fault. Yes.
There you go. Thank you. So 11 seasons on Cheers, and then within days of tearing down the Cheers set on Stage 25 in Paramount, the stage for Frasier went up. Talk about how the character Frasier Crane, who was known for drive-by comedy in Cheers, drive-by? Hit and run comedy. They're similar. On Cheers had to be changed in order to star in his own show.
Well, why don't I interview you for that?
Okay. Well, we'll skip this question.
No, these guys, Glenn and I had nothing to do with the creation of that show. It's David, Peter, and David who created that show. They came to us and said, we want to spin off Kelsey. They were smart enough to know that they could take a buffoon from Cheers and make him a straight man on Frasier, which is what they did. So it's a tribute to these guys.
Thank you.
I directed the pilot in, I think, 20, 25 episodes. I had a ball on it, but these are the guys who created it. And as you can see from his shoes, he's doing very well.
I'm so glad I asked that question. Your epilogue is titled Die With Your Boots On. And it was the first time I really put a name to this thing that you did to us during the pilot of Frasier. During the rehearsal week, Jimmy kept saying, the show needs a scene. You need to see Martin at home disrupting Frasier's life, and you don't have it. And I'm like, well, we don't think it's right for the pilot. No, you need to have this scene in there. You really have got to do it. And so we go back and go, Jimmy really wants us to do this scene. I guess we better do it. So we stayed up till 1 or 2 in the morning writing this scene where Martin's disrupting Frasier's life at home, making smelly breakfasts and that sort of stuff. And all during the writing of it, we go, I don't know, we just don't think this is right. And finally said, well, one of us is just going to have to tell Jimmy that we don't think this is right. So I believe I volunteered, and I called you up the next morning, and I said, Jimmy, we're so sorry. We really tried, but we really don't think this scene belongs in the pilot. And you went, okay. I just wanted to make sure you had the courage of your convictions. And that's dying with your boots on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank
but
you.
But
we used it in the second episode.
Yeah, but I also made you put a second scene with Niles in.
That one you did, and that one worked beautifully.
Yeah.
If I do say so myself. So, an infamous casting error in Frasier. We initially cast the actress Lisa Kudrow in the role of Roz. And how many days were we in? 4 days into rehearsal?
Yeah, 3 or 4, yeah.
Yeah. When it became clear that wasn't going to work out.
Well, it's just because of that scene where she has to turn Frasier. She has to convince Frasier to go and confront his father. And Lisa doesn't play in those colors. I mean, she's a brilliant actress and my dear friend. And she just doesn't play that strength you needed in that scene. if she probably could have played it, but it wouldn't have been as good as Perry played it. And so I said to the guys, I don't think this is going to work out. And I think you guys agreed or knew it, that those scenes weren't working.
Yeah.
And so we replaced Lisa. And I did in 94, because I did Frasier in 93 and 94, I was doing I was going to do the Friends pilot. And as you know, Lisa, it was unfortunate for Lisa that she was fired from Frasier, right?
Yeah.
I was going to do the Friends pilot, and so when Lisa heard that, she was in the makeup room or something like that, and she said, "I can't believe that fucking Jimmy Burrows is going to do it." And I heard this, and but she, we had a great time on the pilot, and look what's happened to her. In fact, I got into her. She was honored at Vassar, and if you want to Google it, she makes a speech that's really funny, and she talks about me. And it's the only time I'm going to get to go to Vassar.
Which brings us to Friends. You say, "I'm constantly amazed but not surprised by how seductive Friends is, how the world fell in love with it, and how it keeps getting rediscovered by each successive generation." I don't think you should be surprised, but there's an anecdote you tell in the book that I just love. Tell us about the plane trip to Vegas.
Oh, God. So I'm 4 shows into it. I think I did the first 4 Friends. I didn't do the whole series. I did 15, and people say, "Wow, we love the fact that you created Friends." I didn't create Friends. Marta Kaufman and David Crane created a brilliant show. I was just the director. Anyway, 4 shows into it. Before the show was on the air, this is the first year, because you start in July, so the shows are ready for September. Every show was a home run. Every show. Like the Frasier show. I mean, before that show went on the air, the shows in July and August were through the roof. The audience just loved it. So I knew there was something special about this show. So I asked Warner Brothers for the jet to take the 6 kids to Vegas. And because I just wanted, with me, it's all about bonding. And it's, these kids were younger than I've worked with before. And I wanted them to, just to have this feeling of going off with me to have a good old time. So I took them to Chinois in Caesar's Palace. And I sat them around the table, and they ordered a lot because they're actors. It reminds me of my story my dad used to say about a starving actor who meets his friend on the street, and he says to his friend, "I got a job." And his friend says, "Great." He says, the starving actor says, I have no lines." And the friend says, "Why is it great?" And he says, "Because I get to eat a sandwich in the second act." So I take him to Vegas. I sit around the dinner table, and I said, "This is something special you have here. And I want you to know, when we gamble and walk through the casino, this is your last shot at anonymity. From now on, you'll never be able to walk through a casino again without being mobbed." And I was right. The show took off, and it's an amazing show that has this perpetuity of appealing to the teens, and will always appeal to the teens.
Interesting. Before we run out of time here, I do want to touch on one of your other major accomplishments, which on Meet the Press, then Vice President Joe Biden said, "I think Will and Grace probably did more to educate the American public than almost anything anyone has done so far. People fear that which is different. Now they are beginning to understand." That's pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. An enormous number of episodes seen by billions of people, literally billions of people. What do you think the secret to that show was?
It was funny.
Funny, yeah.
It was funny. It was a sitcom with 4 people. 2 of them happened to be gay. I like to say it was 4 women in the show. I like to call it a fairy tale, literally and figuratively.
Oh, come on.
It was, I read that script and I said, I have to do this show. The boys, Max Mushnick and David Cohen, handled it brilliantly. The script was extraordinary. And we knew that 25% of the country is not going to watch the show. So there was the gray area after that 25% that we had to get. So we worked hard on making it as funny as possible so that if somebody tuned in just to see a little bit, they'd start laughing and maybe they would watch a little more. And the great story I tell with that, in reference to, he was Vice President Biden then, is that I drove carpool on Thursday, and Thursday night was when Will and Grace was on. And I drove Maggie's carpool. She was in 8th grade, so there were 13 and 14-year-olds in the car. And invariably, on the way to school, one of the kids would say, "What's on Will and Grace tonight?" So I knew that people, before they before they were conditioned or anything like that, had experienced this show. So maybe it helped them with how they felt about gay people after that. So we never set out to proselytize at all on that show. It was always about as funny as possible. Yes, we did the occasional conversion camp show and stuff like that, but I'm really proud of how important that show became. And
David, I know you could all sit here and watch them talk for another 2 hours. I know I could, but we got to call it a day. So read the book, and if you have any questions, line up over here. He'll sign your book. Please join me again in thanking the incredible Jim Burrows and David Lee.
Oh, thank you.